the people protesting against the conflict in Gaza. I hate calling it conflict because basically it's people who are being killed. And it's a cycle of violence. I want to recognise it's a cycle of violence because you can't talk about what's going on in Gaza without talking about what happened on October the 7th as well in Israel. But as we all know, anti-war protest has gone on for decades, hundreds of years. And the right to protest is time-honoured, it's legitimate, and it's important as well, because it's heartbreaking to see people losing their lives. So Lee Anderson is the previous Tory Party vice chair, and what he said was that the people demonstrating are Islamists, and that the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, given the capital city away to his mates. Right, both of them. Both comments very, very offensive. Islamists, for anybody who doesn't know the term, basically refers to Islamic fundamentalists. Now, I would not suggest anybody, middle-aged white women, young black men, children, people of all races, many of them Jewish among the people demonstrating against seeing the loss of life and the scale of the loss of life in Gaza. I don't think any one of them are Islamic fundamentalists. They're just people who just don't like seeing death, destruction, starvation, and all of those things that we've been seeing on TV, hearing on the radio, reading about in our newspapers. But there seems to be this move to dismiss those people as either extremists or supporters of terrorism and supporters of terrorist groups. And none of that is true. But that's the movement of people like Lee Anderson and other people like that. And it's given rise to this whole debate about Islamophobia in the Tory Party and on the far right of the Tory Party. And I've written in the Daily Mirror about the fact that the Tory Party and the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak can't even address and call it what it is says a lot. But the second thing is that it's not a new debate, and lots of people who are shocked by it, they forget that Boris Johnson, 2019, he referred to women wearing the burqa as letterboxes, and he was given the opportunity by Beth Rigby at Sky News to apologise for it, and he refused to take the opportunity and dial it down. And for me, that gave the green light to all sorts of other MPs on the far right of the Tory Party in the government to be racially offensive. And that's what they've taken over lots of years. And last year, when Suella Braverman, at the time she was the Home Secretary, she gave one of the most divisive, bigoted, reprehensible speeches I can remember for years, the kind of thing that I heard growing up in the 70s and 80s, the kind of thing you would have heard from Enoch Powell. And there were people who were criticising Lee Anderson and trying to distance themselves from his remarks, and they were in the room clapping at the time. So we're almost trapped in a kind of terrifying race to the bottom at the moment, because we've got people who are in charge of the country who want to deny people the right to say, look, I don't want to see people killed in my name. And we've got a rise in anti-Semitism, we've got a rise in Islamophobia, we've got a rise in racism, anti-black racism. We are in a very, very febrile moment in this country. And look, I love my sport, I love my entertainment, I love all sorts, but these are important issues that we have to be aware of and that we have to talk about and we have to find some resolution to.
Suella Braverman could easily end the year as the leader of the Conservative Party. Former Home Secretary, you mentioned, she was writing in the Daily Telegraph, she says, Islamists are now in control of Britain. They've bullied our country into submission, she says. The UK is sleepwalking into a ghettoised society, threatening free expression and British values.
And a former London minister, Paul Scally, said that there were no-go areas in Tower Hamlets. You know, like, I work in Tower Hamlets and in Birmingham. I work in Tower Hamlets. I work at Canary Wharf. You know, it's utter nonsense. But I do just want to go very quickly back to what Braverman said, because it's really, really important, and we all know this. There is, when Rishi Sunak became PM, there was this move to say, oh, what a wonderful triumph for diversity. Diversity is not demonizing people who look like you or making life worse for people who look like you. People who think it's a triumph for diversity if somebody brown goes into the highest office in the land is a good thing. It's very naive, because if you are going to go into that post and make life worse for people who look like you, then you're just the same as the people who preceded you.
The thing that gets me is just the inability to call it what it is. When it's Islamophobia. Like, I don't get why it's so tough. Rishi Sunak was asked about the comments of both Braverman and Lee Anderson. Was basically like, I don't want to make the situation worse. And I'm like, well, by not being able to say what this is, I get it. If he did, he would have put both MPs in a position where he couldn't bring them back. He needs Braverman because he wants to hold on to votes onto the right of his party. But that's in itself underlines the issue, because that is another green light to Islamophobia, because it's basically saying the Prime Minister of this country, you know, she's saying that Islamists are in control, but it's clear that in fact she and a faction of their party are in control of the Prime Minister, because he can't even call a spade a spade. He can't even say, yeah, that was Islamophobic and it was incredibly offensive. He can't even say that. Why? Because he is so weak as a politician that he needs people in that part of his party to at least, and don't think Braverman individually will be one of those people giving him support, but the people that share her views want to think, is this guy representing me?
Well, sorry to cut you, but that's the reason why he won't call it. I understand why he won't call it out. It's an election year, so he needs to try and curry as much favour amongst, even if it's a fan base.
But he took the whip from Lee Anderson.
He did. But what I understand why he didn't call it out for what it is, I don't understand why he hasn't just sidelined the two of them completely from the party. Like, call it. I understand why he won't come on TV and say this is X. I get why he won't do that, but I don't get why he just sideline them completely. I think Darren has really articulated the problems of the politics of the issue here, but I'm also just one of the kind of comments on the humanity that I'm seeing, and I mentioned that it's an election year, and some of the language that's been used by senior politicians is just so not subtle, it's just blatant in what it is now. We're at that point now where frontline politicians can just say stuff that is just like so offensive for votes, and I want to put the spotlight on the public, because these people are voted in, right? They don't just get there for no reason, they're voted in. So when you have politicians, whether you're red or blue, that are saying things that anyone with half a brain can tell is divisive, is offensive and problematic at best, and you still lend your support to that individual or that party, I'm now looking at you more than I'm looking at Lee Anderson, I'm looking at Suella Braverman. I get why they're saying what they're saying. What I don't get is why you want to support somebody who doesn't have the humanity to understand there are groups of people, whether it's black people, whether it's Muslims, whether it's Jewish people, who are suppressed wherever it is in the world they may be, or having day-to-day difficulties living in a country like England. Why you don't understand that why what they're saying is impactful, and you giving your vote to those individuals is problematic. That's my concern. In a year where it's looking like Labour are going to be the next government, how they govern, we'll see, and there's issues with the Labour Party that I have as well. But people that can still hear Lee Anderson say what he's saying and still just in the face of defiance decide, yeah, it wasn't that bad.
A lot of people agree. A lot of people agree, one.
Well, that's an issue. That's an issue in itself.
Two, a lot of people will look at other parties and say, well, your record on race isn't great.
No.
So who are you to talk?
Yeah.
And there's been people within the extreme left of your party who have said massively anti-Semitic things. So why you would want to vote for either of them is then the question. So I agree with you in that regard. But if you're talking about the one party, well, people will say, what are my options?
I think what they've decided, what they've succeeded the politicians have been doing, certainly the government have been succeeded in doing, is polarizing the debate to such an extent that people see it as an either or. My biggest fear around this is that there are real world consequences for people. And I've lived through periods of time where we've seen explosions of violence on the streets as a result of what the politicians have said. That whole xenophobia, that whole looking sideways at your neighbour who you would otherwise get on well with as a result of what the politicians are saying, and the way that they're framing things and the way that they conflate supporting a ceasefire with being a supporter of terrorism. And what they aim for is the people who don't look at the detail. They're not aiming for the people who look at the big picture, because they know they can't reach those people, because those people are well informed enough to know that they're talking nonsense. What they're aiming for are the people who only look at the sound bites. It's a very straight out the Donald Trump playbook. They're looking for the people who can't. They take their news from the net, not necessarily from traditional media or reliable sources. They get the bits, the little bits, and they think that's enough to be going on with. And that's not a criticism of those people, because obviously everyone's very busy and we live in a very different world when everybody waited and got the newspapers of a morning and had a read of it before they went about their business. But the danger of that is that people are not, in some cases, that they listen to some of these politicians and they act on the basis of what they say, the way they frame things. And we also live in a digital media world where those politicians are able to flood social media with certain things.
And sorry to cut you down, and more than that, they have channels. They have their actual broadcasters now.
I was getting there.
These politicians, it's not enough that they can give offensive and divisive quotes to mainstream newspapers or just tweet something offensive. They actually have a 3-hour show on mainstream TV and cable TV where they can steer a narrative for 3 hours the way they want. That's the difference now as well. They have they have mouthpieces to their audience that is beyond just an article in a paper or a 140 character tweet. That's also a problem.
And see, in the 70s, you had people like Enoch Powell who could either do a speech or print leaflets and put them through people's letterboxes. Now you have people like Lee Anderson who can get onto your phone.
You can watch these channels on your phone on the way to work.
And even though in the old days you would say, well, let's sideline them and let's not give them a platform. When Suella Braverman gave that speech last year, it was broadcast live by our national broadcaster to the country. I remember being at work and seeing it on the TV and I'm thinking, imagine you're an Asian kid, a black kid, a Jewish kid, a different kid watching this and thinking, or a family who lives in a febrile area. Imagine what you must be thinking, the terror that you must be in, being fomented by people whose positions and whose job it is to actually keep us safe, dial down the rhetoric, and instead she's whipping it up. And that's where we are. It is a race to the bottom. And I think that people like Lee Anderson, he might have gone, but it's what he represents. It's the party he represents that puts us all in danger.
Any solution?
I think a change to the voting system and the way we have different types of parties, I think, is the way out.
No, but when it comes to us being able to call it what it is, and the politicians being able to speak freely, rather than us
being the media.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that changes anything. I think they say something offensive, media calls it out for what it is, but ultimately the change we want is a government that is compassionate and competent. And that's only going to happen if we have politicians who are compassionate and competent. They're only going to get elected if we, the people, have a party to vote for who is compassionate and competent. So I think calling it out is needed and great. And I work for a broadcaster that does, I think, a very good job in doing that. And you work for a paper that does front pages that do that very well. I don't know how that tangibly changes things, personally.
I think, the first solution is at the ballot box. Everyone has the power in that regard. And you would hope that people do use that power, because obviously there's never been a more important time, I would argue, in the last few decades than now.
So to cut you again, but to Hugh's earlier point, some would argue, okay, I'm voting really between Labour and Conservatives. Is there a significant difference?
Well,
Would be the question some would ask.
Yes, and with some justification. But what I would say is that, as appalled as you might be over certain issues relating to Labour, and certainly I've raised for a long time, that my concern at the lack of new black male Labour prospective candidates to fight the next election. Yes, David Lammy's done a great job, and Dawn Butler and all of the others have done a terrific job, but where are the new, younger people who represent this city that we're recording this in? London, Birmingham, Manchester, all over the country. Where are they? So there are those issues relating to Labour. But I think the alternative is to allow a party to retain control that puts us all in danger, that continues with the inflammatory rhetoric, that wants us to hate somebody who's white, who's Asian, who's Jewish, who's Muslim, who wants us to not want to show any compassion for our fellow men. We've never been about that, and we should not be about that as a country.
My major fear is actually that it gets worse if the Tory Party are the opposition, because then they feel free
To say what they want.
And to build the pillar of their core movement around that divisive stuff.
But they'll feel free to
because
say
they don't have to have policies. You know, Labour get criticised for not having a true policy. You're in opposition, you don't have to have a policy. All you need to do when you're opposition is oppose.
Yeah.
Say something that negates what the ruling government
That's true, but,
are doing. So I actually think...
But then on the flip side of that...
in charge.
But the flip side of that is that although they have the power to oppose, they don't have the power to impose. They don't have the power to introduce laws that demonize people, that leave people to... I need to be careful with my words. But they don't have the power to do certain things that leave this country in the tinderbox state that it's in at the moment.